The tape counter blurred between frames, 443, 444, 444. Jamie watched because they always watched the unwatchable. There was a small, perverse hospitality to old things that insisted on being found. Dead websites, burned-out forums, a stray VHS on the bottom shelf of a thrift store that smelled like attic dust and lemon oil. Jamie collected them the way other people collected stamps or bruises, with a practiced eye for what might singe the edges of memory. The clip looked like a child's memory someone had filmed poorly. Pastel wallpaper, sun that came through a set window and never warmed anything, and a host who smiled the way a person smiles at a tax form. Perfunctory and overly bright. The host was tall, sleeve-rolled, hair parted in a precise line. They wore a cardigan the color of overripe melon. The camera lingered on the host as if embarrassed to move. A chorus answered, thin as tissue paper. Brightside, brightside, we sing and know, remember me, and I'll remember you. The jingle should have gone on, should have resolved into a laugh and a clap and a cartoon cutaway. Instead, it hit a patch of static, like an old radio catching a station it could not hold. Jamie's chest tightened. For a beat, not a thought, not an idea even, but an impression, the sort of detail that has the force of truth because it is too inconsequential to be invented. They were 9 or 8, or somewhere in the pale of childhood. There was a red balloon, one of the standard glossy balloons you get at cheap parties. A cake with too many candles, the wax like a map of someone else's small disasters. Someone crouched and whispered their name. The voice belonged to a man whose face should have been anonymous. Instead, Jamie knew the scar behind his ear, the flour smudge on his left knuckle, the way he smelt faintly of lemon and something sink deep and soft. Jamie sat very still. The room hummed with the refrigerator and the laptop's fans. The VHS player, a broken thing Jamie had found in a box labeled estate sale, miscellaneous, clicked and hissed, and the red LED on the front bled like a heartbeat into the dark. They scrubbed backward. The frame jittered, soft as breath. The host leaned in, closer to the camera than it had any business being. The host's lips moved almost perfectly in time with the jingle, as if they had been filmed twice. Once for sound, once for something else. The jingle finished, and the host said, in a voice that was too small to be any human's first language of reason, "We keep each other safe, don't we?" Jamie's fingers left a smudge on the player's plastic, a pale fingerprint the shape of a bruise. They rubbed it with the sleeve of a shirt and felt suddenly absurd, like someone who had been caught listening at a neighbor's window. The memory, if it could be called that, dragged at them, a hook catching on a seam they did not know they possessed. The red balloon hung, impossible and patient. They uploaded a 30-second clip of it into a private chat with Lena at 4:46 a.m., text flat and careless. "Did you ever see this?" Lena replied with 3 fire emojis and, "OMG, where did you even find that? Post it." Jamie didn't mean to post it. They didn't think of virality or of the fact that things like this spread because there was a market for being unsettled, for trading a chill like currency. They thought instead about the way the host had said, "We keep each other safe, don't we?" As if safety required a ledger and a witness. They thought about the red balloon. They clicked post. Jamie liked being skeptical. It was a practical sort of armor in a life where people sold feelings as if they were tap water. They ran a small channel that stitched together urban myths and internet oddities, pulled them through a thread of humor, and then smoothed off the edges until the audience could laugh at themselves for having believed. Debunking paid the rent more often than not. It made them useful. Lena called while Jamie sat at their editing station, a tangle of cords and half-empty mugs. Lena's voice was a bright, impatient thing over the phone. "Okay, I posted the full clip on the old board. People are losing their minds. There's a thread about a lost episode. Brightside Corner, you've got to see this." Brightside Corner, the name should have been familiar and wasn't. The internet loved local kids programming the way cats loved boxes. It nested into niche corners and never left. Clips surfaced from public access channels and cable graveyards. Someone always recorded the peculiar. Someone else always hoarded it. Jamie thumbed through their notes while Lena described the thread. There's a host. People call him Mr. Alder. Some say he disappeared. Others say the last episode was erased. Someone in the thread, actual archivists, pinned a production still with a studio logo. It's from Harlow. Lena's breath made the headphone wire bump like a tongue. We could do a quick reactive thing. You do that thing where you slow down the audio and point out the difference between a production delay and actual sublimation. It would be fun. Jamie made the face that meant maybe. It was the same face they used when offered poorly made coffee. Send me the file. The clip came in a compressed blur. Jamie plugged it into their editing suite and let it roll. The jingle came in like warm soup, then curdled into static. The host, Mr. Alder, if the names in the thread were to be believed, fixed the camera with an expression like someone holding a smile until it stamped on their teeth. The immediate response from Jamie's brain was professional. Analyze, annotate, find artifacts. The second response, small, nonverbal, animal, was the sense that someone had turned a page of their life. There was a backyard with a swing set. There was a mite of a hand smudged with icing. There was a name, Tommy, scrawled on a paper hat in fading marker. Jamie's fingers moved before their skepticism could catch up. They made a short reaction video, precise and a little sarcastic, highlighting obvious edits, pointing out mismatched frames. It was the sort of thing their channel did well. If there was anything to the clip, they told their subscribers with the practiced distance of someone used to selling doubt, they would find the toxicity in the production, the explanation in a cut and not in a conspiracy. They uploaded it at noon. It took an hour for the first comment to appear under the clip. Don't watch all of it. It remembers. Jamie laughed aloud at the screen. A commenter with a string of numbers for a handle and a profile picture that looked intentionally blurred had typed it. The remark was meant to thrill, the kind of coy menace that lived on message boards, and Jamie treated it as such. They typed back, classic. What? Like some cursed cartoon? Very on brand for a Thursday. Then the messages stacked. A user wrote about waking at 4:44 for a week. Another described the exact backyard with a swing set and a splintered bench jammed into memory. A third posted a photograph of a cake with staggered candles. The comments read like a shared hallucination. Lena texted, "People are saying, the jingle calls your name." Jamie scrolled and felt the shiver begin, like a hand running down the spine of a shirt. The threads, which had seemed coherent and modular a moment ago, now braided into something more acute. The coincidence that too many people were certain of the same detail might have been coincidence. It might have been the effect of pattern recognition, of human minds stitching meaning from scraps. It might have been nothing. But when Jamie turned away from the desk, the apartment felt suddenly wrong. The plant in the corner looked like it had been moved an inch. A small plastic clown, cheap enough to have been sold as a prize at a carnival, sat on the windowsill, where Jamie was certain it had not been that morning. They touched its nose and left a faint smudge of dust on the cheap vinyl. "That's not mine," they told Lena over the phone, not because they thought Lena could solve anything, but because saying it into a human voice made the fact less likely to compress into an internal panic. "Maybe it's a prop from the clip," Lena said. "Someone mailed it to you. Dex might be playing at. Dex didn't send a clown." Jamie felt silly. Their voice was too small. They hung up and taped a post-it over the clown's painted smile. Did not belong. At 4:44 that night, the jingle threaded through the apartment like a draft. It was not loud. Perhaps the neighbor, perhaps a commercial. Perhaps the city had a memory that co-opted the same tones because those tones were optimal for embedding. Jamie woke to the same small ache at their temples that heralded panic. The tape counter in their peripheral vision blinked 4:44 on the old VCR as if someone else had said it. They turned the screen on and watched a frame they had not scrubbed to. The host leaned forward, closer than before, and the corner of the frame contained a hand scribbling a name on a paper hat. The letters were clumsy and reversed. The name looked impossibly like Jamie. The clip mutated from content into dare. Someone, Dex, some charismatic streamer with the fast smile and the perfected cadence of attention economy fame, reposted Jamie's short with a challenge. Find the full episode and watch it. #lost episode challenge flared like a match into dry reeds. People do challenges that prove things about themselves online. It was an updated version of the dares teenagers used to exchange in voicemail threads. Jamie watched the challenge spread like a slow bloom. Dex's version had a silver tongue. He framed it as a stunt, the kind that made his sponsors blanch and his followers cheer. People tuned in live stream style to watch other people watch it. Jamie's inbox filled with messages. Did you see this? Do it. Don't do it. Live streamers posted shaky footage of themselves sitting in cheap chairs and swallowing hard as they pressed play. Chat balloons drifted across screens. I see my house. It called my name. Someone is at my window. The spectacle attracted adrenaline and also a certain kind of appetite. Viewers came for the jump, for the whispered click of attention. Jamie started to do what they did best, sift signal from noise. They read threads, traced IPs in as much as their skills allowed, reached out to an archivist on a private board who had an actual address for a public access station called Harlow Access. They learned the basics. Brightside Corner had aired in the early 90s sporadically on a municipal station. It had a small crew, local kids as extras, cheap puppets, and overwhelmingly cheerful music. It ended in 92. There were rumors of a production accident, some staff member getting hurt, some lawsuit, the kind of vagary that pressed its palms to the truth and said nothing. Comments kept growing more detailed. A person in Ohio typed that they had found a Polaroid with their face in the background but had never been to Harlow. Another wrote that when they watched, they remembered a toothbrush with a chipped handle and an uncle that nobody else remembered. Each report included a detail that was specific enough to be credible and absurd enough to be alarming. Jamie felt the fissures of the world open and widen, and their professional curiosity scraped something like postureless dread immune. At the edge of the hours between editing and sleep, Jamie had a dream that was not a dream, and a memory that was not memory. In it, they stood in a kitchen painted in a color their mother would never have chosen. Someone handed them a paper hat. They put it on, crooked, and a man cupped their face and whispered, "Remember me." When they woke, the apartment smelled faintly of lemon oil. A message blinked in the top corner of their feed, a screenshot of a birthday party posted by a user named Tommy_Remember. The caption read, "We were there." Jamie's instincts scanned for fraud. People love to be convincing. Memory is a pliant thing and can be manufactured with images and sound. Photos could be aged, timestamps could be faked. Still, there was an uglier possibility. Some mechanism in the footage, some audio artifact, was tugging at cognition in a way Jamie could not neatly parse. A pattern moved through the clip, the lull of the jingle, a precise cadence, a repetition of a melody at 4:44. Repetition could anchor a memory, could prime the mind for a script. They set a controlled experiment like someone setting a mousetrap. Jamie watched the full clip alone, the lights off. They recorded their own reaction, planned to annotate the suspect frames and expose the trick. The video played as it had before, the host speaking small, the set flat and well lit. The jingle repeated at the finish, then the static. Jamie felt the same tug like a fisher's line gliding along bone. At 4:44 a.m., they woke to the same tune low and clear, as if it had been tucked into the architecture of their sleep. The VCR had stopped with the counter at 4:44 as if it had clicked there on purpose. A new comment appeared under their post, from an anonymous profile that used no words, a single string of digits. The digits were not a time, but they looked suddenly like a phone number spliced into a pattern that might be read backwards, 4444. Jamie took the clown off the windowsill and wrapped it in a dish towel. They could feel, under the cheap fabric, a pressure against the vinyl as if something small was not yet finished being performed. Lena stayed quiet on the other end of the line. The warmth of her presence was a tether. "We should archive this," Lena said finally. "Not post, not destroy. If it's doing whatever it's doing, then we need to understand the mechanism." Jamie wanted to agree. They wanted to be the rational person who archived and annotated and cataloged. Instead, they thought of the red balloon, of the party that might not have existed, of a man whispering the wrong name. They thought of how easy it had been to click post. They had laughed at the comment about being remembered and felt the laugh shift to the back of their throat. "You and me, then," Jamie said. "We'll go quiet. We'll trace the origin." Lena told them to be careful. She did not say, "Don't watch it again." She said, "Be careful." The phrasing suggested she knew, on some unguarded level, that there were things you could break by looking at them too straight. Harlow was smaller than Jamie expected. From the highway, the town looked like a subject in a postcard. Low brick buildings, a closed diner with a hand-painted sign, a bandstand painted a cheerful blue that peeled into long curling strips. The public access station sat on the edge of downtown, a squat brick place with a metal sign that read Harlow Media Services and a bulletin board with a flyer for a senior yoga class. Jamie had imagined a resourceful archivist waiting by the door with a raincoat full of tapes. Instead, they met Doris, who ran the front desk and wore a cardigan like a history book. Her hair was softened by age and perm. Her eyes slipped over Jamie like secondhand coats. "You're not the first?" Doris said when Jamie told her who they were and why they had come. Her voice had the flat cadences of someone who had seen fads and tragedies rhubarb into one another for years. "We had a few folks last week, then a podcaster last night. They all want the same tape." Jamie's palms felt hot. "Is there an archive here?" Doris pointed at a back room with a stack of labeled boxes. The boxes smelled of dust and the kind of adhesive that never truly dries. Jamie knelt and ran a finger along a label. Brightside, Prod 1991. There were 7 boxes and 1 small crate with a handwritten label. Master. Ep 13. Home. Do not duplicate. The crate sat like a secret under a blanket of plastic. Jamie's throat tightened. "Who locked it?" Doris shrugged. "It was Mrs. Hale's." Jamie understood this intuitively now. It wasn't merely the footage that was dangerous, it was the attention. The live stream of Dex watching a master copy was a masochistic sort of theater. He leaned into the set like a man who smelled money. His grin grew infuriatingly bright as he clicked play. His viewers watched him watch. When the jingle reached a particular phrase, his smile changed. It thinned into something that looked for all the world like recognition. His viewers began to type. He's smiling like he remembers something. He's whispering. Dex laughed at first, then didn't. He seemed to be listening to something only the camera could gather. Chat erupted. People vouched for their own recollections, then attempted to coax Dex into saying his childhood friend's name. He made a sound like a man balancing a lie. "It's," he said, caught, and he swallowed. The feed cut to static and then to somebody else's thumbnail reaction. An eye too wide. Jamie wanted to reach through screens and shake people back into the world. They realized with the clarity of someone who has been pushed up against a window that the spectacle itself perpetuated the thing. Each click, each view, fed it a peculiar kind of oxygen. "What if it grows with witnesses?" Jamie said to Lena that night under the fluorescent light of a cheap diner. The coffee was bitter in a way that matched their mood. "Then we have to stop being witnesses." Lena's fingers curled around the mug like a person holding onto a small animal. "But you can't unsee once it has opened. We can pull files, ask people to take down streams. We can make it less visible. We can try to remove the most accessible copies." "It might already exist in people's heads," Jamie said. "Not as copies, but as things that found purchase." They started with what they could touch. They contacted hosts, pressed for deletion. They reached out to the people who ran upload boards and asked for cooperation. Some complied, others refused. Dex's followers argued the whole phenomenon into a ritual of celebrity. To resist was to be square. To watch was to be part of something ephemeral. The internet, Jamie thought bitterly, has always needed a way of making gods out of content. Late that week, a live streamer with thousands of followers put on a toy crown and watched the master tape on camera. She laughed nervously at first, then began to cry. On camera, her face blurred. Her viewers typed their own names into chat with an urgent tenderness. Jamie felt the world narrow to a simple calculus. The more who watched, the more complete the memory became across different people. The tape, and whatever ghost lived behind it, needed witnesses. And witnesses, once assembled, could make a fiction into a past. They tried to burn copies. They found it was difficult to erase something that traveled like breath. A deleted file copied itself elsewhere. Screenshots multiplied. Whispered accounts became narratives that grafted themselves to lives. For each destruction, there was a rebirth. When Jamie opened Miriam's crate again that evening, they found, inside the box, a Polaroid tucked like a talisman. Someone had scrawled a child's handwriting on the edge. Tommy. The face in the background looked like Jamie. The more they tried to deny it, the more the memory pressed until it bled into definition. At 4:44 in the morning, Jamie woke with the taste of cake in their mouth and the feeling of small hands inside their own. They could not tell whether they had once been a child in someone else's story or whether the story had reached out and told a child into being. Both possibilities were scary in the same way. One meant they had been stolen from, the other meant they were being offered a place to live in a life that was not theirs to inhabit. They sat on the edge of their bed and let the hum of the city rise like a chorus. Outside, a window opened and a neighbor called to someone on the street. Jamie stared at the black rectangle of their TV, at the faint blue line of the VCR's display, 4:44. At the bottom of an inbox full of panicked emails, a new message arrived. The subject line was one word, remember. The body contained a single attachment, a 30-second loop of the jingle, slowed down until the syllables smeared into something like a whisper. At the very end, a voice, small and intimate like a person leaning across a bed to tuck a child in, said, "Remember me, and I'll remember you." Jamie closed the laptop very gently, as if the machine could bruise. They had meant to be a utilitarian chronicler of internet oddities. Now they were someone who had pushed a button and watched something begin to move. They could feel, under their ribs, the shape of a childhood trying on their bones. Harlow smelled like old paint and rain that had never quite left the eaves. Jamie drove slowly down the main street as if the town's pace might teach them something they couldn't glean from forums and feeds. The diner windows were lined with paper placards advertising community bingo. The hardware store's sign listed nails and grief support in the same italics. People on porches watched like curiosities, then looked away when Jamie met their eyes. The public access station sat at the end of a block like a tooth missing its filling. Low brick, a single glass door, a poster taped crookedly promising local voices, "Call in." The building looked lived in and exhausted. Jamie felt, for the first time since they had watched the tape, that they were standing somewhere that might remember things differently than the internet remembered them. Miriam met them on the sidewalk, coat buttoned against a draft that did not exist. She was smaller up close, and when she smiled, there were old weather lines at the edges of her mouth. "You came back," she said simply. "You left me a key in the crate," Jamie said. It sounded like an accusation. Miriam just folded her hands and looked at Jamie the way an editor looks at a manuscript with a sentence that might save or ruin the whole piece. "We keep things," she said. "We keep things until someone decides what to do with them." Her voice had the bluntness of someone who had once delivered instructions to children and found the instructions still carrying weight. You wanted the tape. You wanted proof. Proof is a hungry animal. They moved through the station like trespassers in someone else's memory. Rooms smelled of coffee and dust, consoles with blinking lights like sleepy insects. Posters from local productions, a recital here, a PTA fundraiser there, hung crooked. In a back storage area, Jamie found props folded in boxes, pastel chairs, a plastic cake with candy frosting, a puppet with a button missing eye. They felt less like objects than like invitations. Jamie's fingers brushed against a papier-mâché sun, and an odd, almost private panic unclenched in their chest. The items were familiar not because they had been in them before, but because something in the tape had taught their nerves to recognize the shapes, as if recognition were a muscle memory. Miriam had softened in the week since Jamie last saw her. "We were young," she said when Jamie asked again about Elias Alder. "We kept thinking we could teach loneliness how to behave. We tried to stitch a friend from footage and song. It was selfish and it was tender, not good things, just human ones." "Why would a tape do this?" Jamie asked. "Why would a jingle become a lever?" Miriam considered that. "You make rituals for the people who don't have them. Songs are good anchors because children repeat them. Names are even better. A name is a promise." She turned then and opened a battered closet door. Inside, beneath a sheet, was a small platform that had once been a set for a backyard segment. It looked ridiculous in the dim room. A painted fence, a fake tree whose leaves had curled. Someone had left a half-eaten paper plate on the edge, frosting fossilized like white coral. Jamie crouched and pressed fingertips into the stale icing. The hair at the back of their neck rose. "Have you seen anything fresh?" they asked. Miriam's jaw worked. "Footprints." She said it as if the word should explain itself. "Not old footprints, fresh ones, in the dust, in the studio, in places no one's been for years. On the floor tonight, I walked in and there were prints that matched my boots." She stopped and a thin laugh broke out. "And," she swallowed, "they matched yours." Jamie's skin cooled. "That's impossible." Miriam's expression turned patient and tired. "We confuse impossible with inconvenient," she said. "But tape remembers in loops. It pressurizes the air around it. People report things. Memory presses. Floors remember the weight of what has been imagined enough." They set up a camera just to prove the foolishness of it. Jamie would show themselves, show the world, that nothing supernatural had been happening in a boarded studio. They positioned the lens toward the dusty stage and left the feed running overnight. Lena wired the footage to a hard drive and jammed it into her bag like a talisman. At 2 a.m, Jamie woke to a ping of messages from Lena. The video had recorded movement. Someone, or something, had crossed the stage at 1:29 a.m. The outline was indistinct, like breath across glass, but the shoes were clear. Small, scuffed, patterned. The camera's timestamp was steady. The town's power had not flickered. The file had not been corrupted. Jamie watched the footage with their hands bunched into fists. The figure moved with the simple directness of a child. It paused beneath the fake tree and raised something small, perhaps a paper hat, perhaps a hand, toward the imaginary sky. For a second, it looked at the lens, and the shape of the face was a smear. But the silhouette's profile alarmed Jamie because it matched the angle of a face Jamie's mind persisted in knowing. The next day, a woman at the hardware store eyed Jamie while fetching nails. "You seen the set?" she asked, voice clipped like someone clearing crumbs. "Strange things keep happening there. My daughter says her doll's hair was clipped different. The boy next door says his father's watch stopped at 4:44. She laughed without humor. Town's got a bad dream and it thinks it belongs in real life. Jamie felt like a person who had walked across glass and noticed it afterward. They asked Miriam if anyone else had reported phenomenon. "A couple of kids down the street," she said. "A man who says he remembers a lost birthday. The paper boy said his bike chain developed a rust patch shaped like a smile." She rubbed her palms together like someone trying to warm them. "You asked for the tape, remember? The tape asked for witnesses." At night, Jamie walked the empty streets. The bandstand's paint peeled in small curls beneath the moonlight. The jingle hummed under their feet like someone playing a distant radio. On a porch, a child's toy glowed in the dark, a plastic clown with one eye missing. Jamie's shadow swallowed it, and the shadow seemed to answer by deepening. They stood, hands shoved deep into their jacket, and listened to the town breathe. There was a quality to Harlow Jamie had not expected, a patient amnesia. The town wanted to be unremarkable. It had 1,000 small denials, an erased episode here, a closed factory there. And those denials were not malicious so much as exhausted. People preferred not to know because knowing required action, and action is noisy and expensive and dangerous. The internet, by contrast, was a grammatical excess. It named and amplified and forced Harlow's private forgettings into public argument. On the second night, Jamie checked the studio door and found fresh footprints across the threshold, turning inward like a polite invitation. They looked like their own. The shoe tread pattern repeated itself in the dust, precise and present. The soles pressed an indentation deep enough that the floor remembered. A childish laugh skittered from somewhere inside the studio, a sound like a bell with a cracked rim. Jamie pressed their palm to the wood as if to stop the vibration. The prints were not a threat, they were an insistence. "Don't make a petitioner of yourself," Miriam warned when Jamie told her. "Footprints are requests. They ask to be followed. Tape makes petitions. People answer." Jamie wanted them to catalog, to trap causation under fluorescent light and label it. But the thought of tracing the footsteps and finding, somewhere in the dark, a birthday they had not earned felt like a moral compromise. If memory could be made, if belonging could be manufactured out of jingle and camera pan, then the question that mattered less was whether it was true, and more whether it was kind. They found themselves in the empty hours thinking like a jury and feeling like a foreigner in their own life. The footprints matched their shoes. The town had quieted its forgettings into fragile, private ghosts, and in the middle of everything, the tape lay in a crate like a sleeping animal, waiting for someone to open its eyes. Jamie looked at the crate again, as if its wood could answer. The label was stern and simple. Master. Epor 13. Home. The word home felt like a promise that had been rehearsed too many times to keep its shape. Outside, a siren passed somewhere in the town, and a dog barked once. When Jamie closed their eyes, they could see a red balloon drifting in a ceiling shaft of broken plaster. Patient, small, and stubborn as memory. The VCR smelled like attic dust and solder. Jamie had driven 2 towns over to meet a man named Carl who collected obsolete tech the way other people collected memories. Gently, obsessively, like a curator of things that were supposed to be dead. Carl's garage was a low cathedral of old electronics. Rows of gimbaled monitors glowed like tired stars. He plucked the VCR off a shelf with a tenderness that made Jamie feel like an intruder in a shrine. "You sure about this?" Carl asked. He had a tattoo of a waveform on one forearm. "Once you play a master reel, you do more than watch. You interact. Old tapes are recorded with a faith in permanence. They think they can hold down the world." Jamie forced a laugh. "That sounds like superstition." Carl's smile thinned into something softer. "You don't have to be the believer to be the believer's partner." He plugged the cable with ceremony, and the old thing clicked into life. They set up the monitor in a cramped room at the back of Harlow Media Services, the walls still smelling faintly of stage makeup and powdered sugar from old craft tables. Miriam hovered near the doorway like a quiet sentinel. Lena stood with her arms folded, jaw clenched the way someone had when they were angry at fate. Jamie slid the master, EP13, home into the VCR. The tape exhaled a hiss before images arranged themselves on the screen. The set, the host in his melon cardigan, the plastic sun. The camera framed a backyard party, a cheap paper banner, a child wearing a crooked party hat, the jitter of a paper plate with frosting. For a single frame, the background registered as if it had always been there, a shabby bedroom that looked like the inside of Jamie's first apartment. The wallpaper pattern, the small faded ducks, it was wrong, but the wrongness had the weight of an accusation. Jamie's fingers went slick. "Play it," Lena said. The host smiled directly into the camera now, closer than any host had a right to be on tape. His mouth formed the jingle. The rooms on the screen felt layered, like panes of glass stacked so that images from different years bled into one another. The host finished, and then, impossibly, he spoke one clear sentence that did not belong in any children's production. "We keep each other safe, don't we, Jamie?" Jamie's head snapped up so fast their necks strained. The name had been there. The syllables retuned the room. Miriam's face folded small, an expression like someone holding ice on an open wound. "That's impossible," Jamie said, though the hairs at their scalp felt electrified. "That's impossible." Carl rewound the tape reflexively. The tape obliged, the motor whirring like a sleeping animal. When the frame slid back into place, there was a new image burned faintly into the leader. A small square of wallpaper, the yellow ducks that Jamie had thought were in an apartment in a different life. The VCR had spit a physical imprint, one of the frames stuck in the mechanism as if the machine itself had tried to make the image permanent. Miriam whispered, "It remembers in material ways sometimes. It presses." She said it like someone who had seen a house set a memory down in its floorboards. Jamie could feel the room tilt. They were a person trained to trace causality in pixels and metadata, and yet a mechanical artifact had behaved like a pen trying to write a name in felt. The tape had not only recorded, it had staked a claim. "Can you duplicate it?" Jamie asked, voice thin with a kind of scholarly fear. Duplication felt both the obvious remedy, more copies for more eyes, and the most dangerous temptation. "Everything copied tends to propagate the effect," Miriam warned. "When you make a run of the tape, it spreads its grammar. It finds purchase in other people's heads." Lena glanced at Jamie. "So what do we do with the master?" The room seemed to lean forward on its old wooden legs as if it too wanted to hear the answer. Jamie understood what the choice looked like the way they might have understood a math problem. Duplicate and risk contagion. Destroy and risk losing data that might be evidence of harm. Leave and risk the tape being found by someone less careful. "It tells us things," Jamie said finally. but we have to be careful about who hears them. They did not reach a tidy resolution. The tape sat in the VCR like an animal that had been roused and might lash out. Outside the building, the town's late light turned itself down like a hand closing over a face. There were footprints on the studio floor when they looked later, small and neat and impossible in their newness. In the dust, somewhere between prop cake and plywood fence, something had crossed. Once you suspected your memories were porous, everything household-sized became a suspect. A cereal bowl could be a conspirator. A chipped teacup might have inherited someone else's breakfast. Jamie's apartment began to arrange itself around the tape from Harlow the way a filed photograph might shift the furniture in a museum exhibit. On a Tuesday morning, the couch faced a wall where it hadn't. The bookshelf held a toy boat they did not own. It sat as if someone had set it down and walked away. The clown, wrapped in a dish towel in their closet, was back on the windowsill when Jamie returned from a panicked run to the store, its painted smile unchanged and indignant. Lena called, voice fast and not quite steady. People are reporting not just memories, but objects turning up. A kid in Missouri found a paper crown on his porch. A woman in Philadelphia discovered a Polaroid of a birthday with her face on it and doesn't remember ever being there. Jamie sat at the kitchen table and felt suddenly like an anthropologist in a culture that had sprouted a new ritual by accident. They scheduled themselves into a sleep clinic like someone making a confession to a bureaucracy. The clinic was pragmatic and white, a place where the body's mysteries were supposed to become diagrams on a page. "You're functioning," the sleep tech told them after a battery of tests. "No overt signs of parasomnia, nothing neurological that we can detect." Jamie wanted to say, "The evidence is on tape." Instead, they said, "Do patterns ever repeat at precise times? Like, are there things your brain is more likely to do at certain clocks?" The doctor considered the monitors with the air of someone who had seen too many human patterns to be surprised by any one. "Circadian rhythms are stubborn," she said, "but if you have learned a cue, say, the sound of a jingle, and that cue has been paired with a particular action repeatedly, your brain can begin to anticipate. It's called classical conditioning." Jamie thought about the jingle and the way the time 4:44 had become a stamp in their life. And if the cue is audiovisual and shared widely. The doctor's expression tightened. She wrote something, collective conditioning, on a chart with a sterile clarity. Then you have a social amplifier. That's psychology and sociology crossing. It can feel like culture altering individual memory, but she hesitated. We don't have terminology for when media retrofits personal history. Back in their apartment, Jamie tore up the floorboard near the heater because they had an inexplicable compulsion to do something physical, to press on wood and see if it sighed truthfully. Beneath the plank, dusty and secret for years, was a cassette in a Ziploc bag. On the cassette, someone had written, in a childish hand, "Happy BDA." Jamie's pulse stuttered. They played it on a tiny Walkman. The recording was lo-fi, a tinny rendition of some nursery tune, an off-key chorus, then a small laugh, high and quick, followed by a voice whispering a name. Their name. The sound was not a manufactured dub. It bore the fingerprints of time, of breath and tape, of a person who had been there and laughed. The discovery was a pin through skepticism. Jamie loved evidence more than grand theory. Here was the cassette, as tangible as a coin. The sound of their laugh vibrated in the Walkman's cheap speakers. It was absurd in a way that felt like betrayal. A laugh they had never remembered making was now cataloged in someone's tape box. They called their mother and did not tell her about the cassette. Instead, they asked what family birthdays had been like when Jamie was small. There was that small human set of hesitations one hears when people are asked to inventory love. Their mother's voice folded into a memory of card games and boxed cake mix and a neighbor who brought over store-bought frosting. No paper hats. No melon cardigan hosts. No mention of holidays seized and transplanted from one life to another. Maybe we thought we did that differently, Jamie said carefully. Maybe our brains lie to us. Or maybe our brains remodel when someone shows them a picture, their mother said. It was a consoling thing to hear. She sounded like someone willing to prefer explanatory stories that preserved the family's narrative. If you're feeling dizzy, honey, take a break. Go to bed. Jamie didn't go to bed. They sat instead with the cassette in the dark and rewound and played, tracking the cadence. The laugh lodged like glass. The whisper at the end, almost too soft, like a secret between adults, repeated the line, "Remember me, and I'll remember you." The phrase sat there like an offer. Meanwhile, the challenge kept eating its own momentum. Dex uploaded a mirrored copy of a master he insisted he had found in an estate sale. His version had commentary and host segments and an attempt at analysis that paled in comparison to the tape's quiet gravity. While he watched, his viewers sent in stories of lost toys, of faces and Polaroids, of memories they could not place. A few thousand accounts later, someone sent a message to Jamie. Dex's father had worked as a stagehand on Brightside Corner. The revelation changed nothing and everything. It explained the tangent that had connected the show to a modern influencer. It suggested a deeper lineage. The viral was filigreed into the past. It also made Dex less indifferent and more culpable. If he had an inherited intimacy with the show, his laughter on camera became another kind of witness, one paid and polished. Jamie tossed the cassette into a box of other artifacts from the studio and covered it with a towel as if concealment would be protection. The objects did not cooperate with such intuitions. They bled implication into the air. Floors remembered, toys arrived, and the world rearranged itself inch by inch toward a narrative that may or may not have been true, but which, held long enough by enough witnesses, acquired the shape of truth. Elias Alder had been a name passed along like pollen. Some called him genius. Others called him a charlatan. Miriam called him a man who had tried to buy immortality with children's laughter. They found the production assistant, Nate, by following a string of faded credits on an employment bulletin and a Facebook profile that showed a man in his 50s who now worked a hardware counter and talked about fishing. Nate had kept an old swatch of the show in his garage and a box of call sheets in the trunk of his car. He was thin, with hands that looked like they had gripped rope and camera cranks. When he smiled, it looked like practice. "They weren't bad people," Nate said when Jamie and Lena sat in his kitchen. He put a chipped mug down and folded his hands. They were hopeful. Alder was obsessive. He thought if you could provide a narrative to lonely kids, if you could literally script belonging, you could stop them from disappearing into bad places. He used to say the camera was a bridge. "How?" Lena asked bluntly. "What did they do that made people remember things they hadn't lived?" Nate's eyes darkened. "We asked families to send home videos. We invited kids to bring toys and stories. We'd film them telling things about their rooms, favorite jokes. Then in editing, we'd splice little bits of those details into the broader episode. It makes you feel seen when you see your favorite spoon in a show. That's normal." But Alder took it farther. He'd loop a phrase. He'd time music to a heartbeat. He'd ask the kid to repeat a name till the cadence had been drilled into their voice. Jamie thought of anchors, of Pavlovian triggers, the way a melody can sit cross-threaded with a feeling. So it was all just suggestion. Nate leaned forward until his voice softened into the shape of an old confession. "You can suggest until you're blue in the face, but you need witnesses. You need the world to agree." The problem came when Alder started experimenting with adults. He wanted the designs to stick. He wanted them to anchor whole lives, lives kids could inherit. He laughed, a brittle sound. "It takes 10,000 witnesses to raise a real past. We had a few hundred." "What happened?" Jamie asked. "We tried it once. We edited the final episode to include an adult as if he'd been a child on the show. It was supposed to be symbolic. He watched it on air. He started to respond like one of the kids, laughing at the same cues. After that, he was never quite the same. They say he left. Some say he lost his mind. Some say he walked into the backlot and disappeared." Nate looked at them like an accusation. Alder kept pushing. People sued. Sponsors pulled. The final episode was buried by the board. But you can't bury things that were played in many ears. Sound gets inside. Lena felt hollow. "So someone made a show that could teach you your childhood if the show had watched it, and if the show had enough voices saying the same thing. And if the show could make the world agree," Nate added. Props show up, or people's front porches become stages. It's like a garden where you plant an idea and the town's memory is the soil. Dex's live stream that night made the garden bloom. He sat in a room with neon lights and commentary, and as he watched the master tape, his grin threaded into something tender, then astonished. He began to weep, something raw that made the chat explode. He whispered into the camera. I remember him. I remember Tom. Some of his listeners begged him for a name. Others typed fragments of their own childhoods, like prayers. Within hours, clips of Dex's reaction had circulated into feeds with a velocity that made Jamie dizzy. Yet what terrified them most was not Dex's tears, but the way his memory grafted itself onto other people's. Fans began claiming overlapping details: a blue tricycle, a scar on a palm, the smell of a lemon on a man's sleeve. 1,000 tiny correspondences lent the whole affair a new gravity. The more people who asserted the same memory, the more likely others were to accept it as real. The mechanism was not mystical as much as social. The human mind as a vessel looking for an anchor rope. Jamie and Lena tried to make a plan. They spoke to lawyers, archivists, people who might obscure the files or scrub the metadata. The technical remedies were messy and partial. A removed file could have already been downloaded. A screenshot could be screen recorded into an offline vault. For every copy they removed, 2 more appeared in private chats and sealed drives. Destroying the master was a rash, brutal sort of logic, and even as they considered it, they felt the ethics of erasure knot in their throats. The tape might be dangerous, but it also held proof of harm. Some records must be preserved to bear witness to wrongdoing. Others, if left unchecked, can make reality itself malleable. Nate said, if you destroy the master, you might slow it. But you also risk freeing the thing from its original constraints. It could metastasize into other formats. It's like burning a seed head and hoping the wind won't catch it. Jamie heard the metaphor and hated it because it made the world too clean. They imagined propellers of uploaded files, found footage remixes, people trimming the jingle into ringtones that tugged at memory in elevator lobbies. The internet, 1,000 small altars of attention, seemed more likely to turn the tape into a religion than to bury it. That night, while they argued the ethics, something happened that sharpened the stakes. A live feed from a teenager who had posted a reaction video went black at 4:44. The chat filled with names. Her mother, watching, described to news crews how the girl had known with the clarity of a child reciting a poem the route to a park that did not exist in her town. Jamie felt the choice compress into a point. The tape was not just evidence. It was a device that, once let out into the world, latched and learned. Dex had become an unknowing apostle. Nate had been part of the machine. Miriam had watched histories compress into props. And Jamie had been the hand that uploaded an artifact into the current stream. They could try to excise it. They could attempt to rewrite the master with an ending that unmoored the jingle's cadence. They could try, desperately and perhaps futilely, to teach the world not to believe a tape more than the people who made it. Outside, someone in Harlow clipped a balloon string and watched red plastic bob into a ragged sky. The balloon rose through a hole in an old ceiling and vanished into a shaft of light like a small, stubborn memory escaping into the air. The thing about being the person who notices patterns is that you grow used to watching the seams. Jamie had expected explanations to have the neatness of a diagram. Edit here, sound there. Instead, the tape had the behavior of an animal. It did not merely prompt, it petitioned. They found the word for it, somewhere between ritual and artifact, on a forum run by people who called themselves media archaeologists. A thread, buried under speculation and memes, discussed parental voice conditioning and performance rituals in local television. One of the posters, an academic with a cautious handle, wrote plainly, "If a recorded artifact is designed to solicit witness testimony, and those witnesses begin to cohere on a shared set of details, those details lose their status as fiction and behave, socially and neurologically, as memory." Jamie read the post until the light outside their window went red and the street lamps blinked awake. "We need to think of it as social architecture," Lena said over the phone. Not a haunted video. Architecture is maintained by people who move through it. If enough people rehearse a version of the past becomes built. They had already seen how the practice worked. Small, specific gestures, repeat the jingle with a pause at 4 beats, show a paper crown in the lower left shot twice, let a child say a name 3 times, wove through dozens of posts, until readers began to reference the same details spontaneously. The jingle acted as a metronome. The name acted as an axis. It was not magic in the Victorian sense. It was a social instrument that found a leverage point in human attention. Midday brought a call from Miriam. Her voice was thinner than a folded paper. "There's something you should know. There was a doctrine in the studio. They called it the completing frame." Alder thought that a missing past could be completed for a child by manufacturing a set of memories and amplifying them across witnesses. He believed that with enough repeated direction, the memory would anchor in the town's shared life like a new statue in a square. Jamie felt the floor tilt. Anchor in people? They pictured a memory nailed into wood, then painted over. Yes. Miriam's breath caught. And if a person can be convinced the memory is theirs, if they're given the right props and the cadence of a name, they will defend it like property. The dangerous part was when Alder tried to anchor adults. Adults are too heavy. The mechanism snaps. The truth landed like a bruise. The tape was not an accidental contagion. It was, at least in part, a project with intent. The show had been designed, however gently, to graft belonging onto blanks. It had promised whole childhoods to people who had none. That idea, tender and desperate, had teeth. Jamie thought of their own private gaps, a missing friend, a name that lingered like an unanswered letter. The prospect that someone had stitched a past onto them, someone who then tried the technique on people who had once been adults, felt invasive in a new way. Their memories were not sacred in an absolute sense, but they were their own. The idea that someone had rehearsed those memories in order to hand them back like tokens made Jamie feel violated. Up in the studio, the town's accounts had begun to cohere into a map. Someone had tracked props that appeared spontaneously across households, plastic crowns, paper plates with the same jagged edge, toy boats of the same manufacturer. Someone else had assembled videos of anxious reactions, people who, after watching, found physical artifacts on their porches that matched the show's props. The artifacts and the testimonies reinforced one another until the whole thing resembled a mass-constructed shrine. Jamie and Lena convened a small council of people who had looked into the studio: Miriam, Nate, Carl, and a reluctant archivist from the State Media Board. They debated options with the grave, airless energy of people planning a funeral for a thing that had once been thought benign. "We can destroy tapes," the archivist said. "We can ask hosts to take down clips. We can begin a campaign to de-emphasize the jingle. But the memory engine is already running. It wants witnesses." "What if we reduce the witnesses?" Jamie asked. "What if we make it unwatchable?" Miriam's lip twitched. "Unwatchable is a tall order. People will download it and spin it back into view. You remove light in one window and another opens. The cultural machine is more persistent than a single tape." The midpoint of the story was not a twist in the cheap sense. It was a change in the stakes, the realization that the phenomenon had been intended to complete people, to create belonging by manufacture, and that the mechanism had already been abused. The tape was less a cursed object and more an experimental theology. It had answers, and the answers came at a cost. "Then what do we do?" Lena asked. The question was a sharp, animal thing in the room. Miriam's eyes wet. "We try to limit it," she said finally. "We try to make the voices quieter, and we have to warn people who are most susceptible, those whose memories have gaps, who might be offered a ready-made childhood. People will pick a past if it looks like belonging." Jamie imagined the choice offered like a cheap, perfect dress. It might fit, it might hide the seams, but it wasn't the wearer's skin. The tape made choices for people that should have belonged to themselves. After the meeting, they left with a plan that felt halting and fragile. Remove accessible versions of the episode, notify platforms, collect physical artifacts and lock them down, attempt to trade the master away into a vault that required legally mediated access. The idea was not to destroy truth, but to prevent the tape from being relentlessly amplified without context. It was a bureaucracy of negation. That night, Jamie dreamed of a room filled with small shoes. The shoes walked in place and sang the jingle softly until the walls remembered the tune. They woke with the taste of metal and the feeling that the world was folding itself into story. The next morning, someone had posted in the town board. The studio doors were open and people had been seen carting props out into the streets. a rumor took seed. Copies had been smuggled. In the distance, the internet hummed like a hive. The master was still a thing that could be moved, argued over, or destroyed. Control was provisional. The ritual under pressure would fight to remain useful. Jamie understood then that containment meant a different kind of courage. It meant denying people an easy belonging, refusing to hand a kid an invented past because it was kinder than the truth. The choice would hurt. The tape would not want the pain. They made a list and crossed things off like a prayer. Step 1, gather every known physical copy. Step 2, find the servers and get hosts to remove uploads. Step 3, warn the public and offer safe counseling resources for those who reported intrusive memories. Step 4, destroy what remained. Destroying art felt like an ethical cliff, but the group had decided that if a recording was actively rewriting people's recollection of their lives, the harm could be worse than erasure. Nate's hands shook when he helped pack the crates. Carl lent a fireproof case and a Protestant sort of calm. Lena, who had never wanted to feel responsible for a viral tide, drove like a person with a simple, furious mission. They started with what was easiest, the school copies, VHS from checkout bins, digitized masters floating in dusty cloud drives. Volunteers, students, bored documentarians, anyone with a stake in stopping the phenomenon, booked flights and drove with hard drives and matches. There were live streams of the destruction. Piles of tapes fed into a rented incinerator, external drives smashed under hammers, servers taken offline. For a while, each act of destruction felt righteous, like stitches cut free. But each time something went, new reports bloomed elsewhere. Someone had already scraped and mirrored. Screenshots were taken and posted into private groups. An uploader in a foreign time zone mirrored a master and came forward to sell it back for astronomical sums. The tape's contagion proved as sticky as the adhesive on a Polaroid. Worst of all, destroying a copy seemed to make certain memories snap forward with fresh urgency. People who had been quietly unsettled now felt violated. Without public framing, they interpreted the deletion as proof of conspiracy. Rumors sprouted that they had been robbed of a childhood that could have made them whole. Some of the town's folks, those who had gravitated toward the created past, were furious. A few families showed up at the studio, faces tight with grievance. "You stole my child," one woman hissed, as if accusing someone of a slow theft. In the middle of it all, Dex posted a video in which he tore down the archive's protective coverings, with his live followers cheering him on. He justified it with a take dressed as moral outrage, transparency after all. Yet his eyes were wet. He insisted he was trying to preserve truth while his hands shook, and the footage showed him holding a corner of the master tape as if it were a relic. Charity and spectacle braided until they were indistinguishable. That night, the group guarding the master convened a plan, a controlled deletion. The idea was to burn the original in a place where nothing digital could reassemble it, under the watch of legal witnesses and with the documentation kept in a court vault. They would create a record of the destruction so historians could write about it without reproducing the artifact. It was a strange, paradoxical compromise. Preserve the fact of the tape's existence without preserving the tape itself. They drove out to an industrial lot at the edge of town at dusk. The incinerator's orange throat leaned like an unblinking eye. People who had been in the show, whose faces had been flattened into the same awful brightness for years, stood with the pragmatic silence of people about to let go of a child they had once birthed and then watched go wrong. Jamie held the master like a thing that might wake. In the thin twilight, the label EP13, home, seemed to gather light like a small accusation. Miriam lit the torch. The flame took the leader first, the tape uncoiling like a slow black tongue. The crowd had the tight hush of an audience at a funeral. For a moment it felt like salvation. The film curled into ash. The VCR motors outside the lot spun down like exhausted animals. People exhaled. Lena pressed her palm to Jamie's shoulder and said, "Maybe it's enough." But the world is a leaky thing. 3 hours later, an unlisted copy surfaced on a private tracker. A mirror appeared in a message board thread. A snippet, altered and re-rendered until the jingle was a ringtone, circulated in a closed group chat. Small objects matching show props were found on stoops in towns that had never known Harlow. A child in a different state woke at 4:44 and hummed the melody in a voice that did not belong to their speakers. And under all of it, like a slow, patient machine, the idea that someone could be given their past kept moving through networks of attention. The incinerator had been a moral act, but not a metaphysical antidote. The ritual they had tried to burn had been copied and transformed. In the deletion's dramatics, it had acquired new witnesses, and new witnesses made new memory. Jamie felt the weight of responsibility like a stone pressed to a wound. Destroying something that hurt did not make the hurt vanish. It rearranged the vectors for how that hurt would travel. And somewhere in the night's small hours, somebody typed a question into a chat. If our memories can be manufactured, which of the memories we keep are truly ours? They did not have an answer. They had only plans: legal counsel, counseling hotlines, a campaign to contextualize the artifact, and a coalition to resist the jingle's repetition. For now, destruction had quieted one throat. The consequences, however, were not confined to the lot where the flames had licked the tape. As they drove back through Harlow, the town's dim windows like soft eyes, Jamie looked at Miriam in the passenger seat. Her face had the small, raw look of someone who has given something of themselves up and then missed the missing thing. "Was it worth it?" Jamie asked. Miriam did not answer at once. Around them, the town breathed and folded into the ordinary chores of mourning. "For some," she said eventually. "For others, it was theft dressed as mercy. It's hard to tell the difference when the mercy looks like belonging." When Jamie went to sleep that night, their dreams were filled with small shoes walking in circles. The ash from the incinerator smudged the edge of the map of this whole affair, but it had not removed the geography. The town still had holes where memory had been made and unmade. The jingle still hummed faintly in people's mouths like something too sticky to wash clean. Outside, in a gutter, a red ribbon caught on a nail. It fluttered in the breeze like a small, obstinate heartbeat. Jamie had not expected courage to feel like being pulled apart. It felt instead like a tape being threaded through a machine. The plan had been half theory and half dare. If the episode needed witnesses to complete itself, maybe the only way to uncomplete it was to refuse to perform. The thought had a stubborn clarity. To stop a story, you sometimes had to step into it and refuse the lines. Lena argued. Miriam argued. Nate argued like someone who had lived through too many bad finales. "You can't just," Lena kept saying. Her fingers found the edge of the table and clung. "What if you get stuck in there?" Jamie remembered a small voice in childhood telling them the hero in stories always survived because they were brave. They had learned, later, that heroes were fictional, but the residue of that voice still did useful work. "I need to know what it asks for," Jamie said. "We think it wants witnesses. If I go in and refuse to play my role, maybe the structure cracks. Maybe it needs someone who gives it what it wants and then says no." Miriam's hands trembled as she helped set the VCR into a ring of legal witnesses and hospital-grade observers, people who could attest the act had been consensual and recorded. They had to document the attempt so that if something went wrong, it could be described, archived, understood. There would be lawyers. There would be cameras. There would be the messy human infrastructure of accountability. The studio smelled like dry sugar and dust. The small set, the little painted fence, the plastic sun, the paper crowns, had always been a model of tenderness gone wrong. Up close, it was childish and decayed, the edges frayed where the set had been reassembled and patched too many times. The master tape sat in the VCR like an animal in a cage. Lena held Jamie's hand until her knuckles whitened. "You can get out," Lena said. "Promise me." Jamie wanted to promise that they would be the same person who had walked in, the same hoarder of skepticism and jokes. They could not promise. "I'll come back," they said. It was the best equivalent they could conjure without bargaining their name. They placed the tape in and threaded the final frame. On the monitor, the host smiled, a smile that was too wide to belong to someone whose job was booth greetings. The sound of the jingle filled the studio as if the old amplifiers had a memory of their own. The VCR hummed, the picture brightened, and the air thickened. Jamie stepped forward. It did not feel like a door opening so much as a page turning. The air slipped and the light took a different grain. The studio that welcomed them inside the tape was the same set and not the same. Proportions were a hair off, like a dollhouse that had been built by someone with a slightly different scale in mind. The sun leaned at a tilt that made shadows spill away from their anchors. The fake grass rustled with a sound like old quilts. Children's laughter, recorded and live and folded back on itself, hung in the air like a chorus. A cheap cake sat on a plastic table, frosting hardened into a fossil of sweetness. Around the table, figures sat in impossible stillness. Their faces were familiar in the sense of newspaper faces you had never quite read. One figure wore a paper hat with a scrawl in childish pen. Tommy. Jamie's throat closed. The figure in the hat looked at them and smiled the way a mirror smiles when you do not move. It moved like memory moves, not by force but by recognition. "We were waiting," Tommy said, voice like paper rubbed over a thumb. The face carried a smear of life that made Jamie want to weep. The host was there too, up close, but not the same animal as the recorded face. This host was more a silhouette of intention, an angle of voice. He uttered the script with a small, patient cadence, the jingle, the pause, then the line that had wound into Jamie's bones. "Remember me, and I'll remember you." They asked names. The room made a ritual of it. A child asked Jamie's name like a bell. "Jamie," the child called. They coaxed, gently, the way someone coaxing a secret. The floor expected an answer. Jamie felt the script curling around their ribs, a neat measure like a glove. The power in the room came from those answers. If you said the name, if you accepted the offered past in language, something in the show completed. If you refused, it had to try another vector. That was the gamble. The ritual had to be allowed to finish if it wanted to hold. They could have lied. They could have said the name and then tried to destroy the memory from the outside. But the lesson of the ashes and the mirrored uploads had been a simpler, drier truth. Lies are scaffolding. If the world's memory was built on lies, those lies would keep standing as long as people chose to keep them. Jamie looked at the small hat with Tommy scrawled across it and thought of the cassette under their floorboard and the laugh they could no longer be sure was theirs. The choice felt like a private theft. To protect other people from a manufactured past, they might have to give up their own comforts. "No," Jamie said. It was a tiny word and everything in the room bristled. The host's smile shuddered. The colors of the set drained, like pigment leached from a watercolor. The children's faces elongated into something more human and less perfect. The jingle hiccuped and then tried again, like someone coaxing a stubborn engine. The host leaned forward, voice folding into a different register, less recorded, more plea. "You're making the choice," the host said, not unkindly. "You can have the thing you missed." "I don't want it that way," Jamie said. The refusal was not dramatic. It was a small, definite collapse of the sentence the show wanted built out of them. They felt themselves pulled toward those missing memories like a tide. The effort to keep 5 words out of their mouth felt like holding breath beneath cold water. Outside, Lena was wrecking the VCR according to plan, smashing the motor, severing the head assembly. So even if Jamie failed to uncomplete the ritual in the set, there would be fewer routes for it to copy itself back into the world canonically. Miriam recited names of their town into a notebook as if saying them aloud would consolidate witness statements into something less fertile. The legal witnesses documented, the cameras recorded, every step of the gamble. Within the set, the host's voice thickened. He tried to barter, "Remember, and you will keep what you lost. Remember, and we will keep you safe." The idea of safety trod softly. Jamie thought of the way belonging can be used as leverage and realized the only true safety was the messy, honest sort that came from people bearing the brunt of truth together. Jamie put both palms against the painted fence and felt the grain of wood beneath the paint. "I will not say my name into your mouth," they said. "You can't make me be someone's past without my permission." The host's expression shifted from smile to something like understanding and then to rage that looked smaller and more ridiculous than it had in the recording. The papered children around the cake blinked, 1, 2, like film frames, and the world began to stutter. "You are refusing witness," the host said. "I am refusing performance," Jamie corrected. The word performance felt like medicine. The set's sound channels thickened and then cracked. The jingle became a smear of static and then a thin, stripped-down whistle that wound out and away. Jamie felt a pressure like someone turning a large, ineffable dial. The edges of the set thinned. The painted sun peeled away and became a hole of daylight. The cake collapsed inward in a slow, polite unbaking. The children's faces blurred and then resolved into ordinary human faces, people who had been pressed into a role and were, for a breath, themselves. Then everything loosened. A sound, low and mechanical, came from nowhere and everywhere. The VCR head outside the set, tearing itself from the machine as Lena finished the final destructive action. On a screen in the studio, pixels bled into noise, and for a handful of seconds, the recorded host looked almost like a person betrayed. The ritual needed a completed witness shape to hold itself together. Without it, the architecture of suggestion crumbled like scaffolding. Jamie stumbled backward out of the set into the real studio as if stepping through a pool of glass. Lena was sobbing, not because the VCR had been destroyed, but because the act of smashing something felt like a redemption they had not trusted. Miriam held Jamie's hand with an empathy that felt like salt and bandage. They had done it, but they had not done it cleanly. The ritual's collapse sounded less like a triumph than a fracture. Some people who had been locked into the show's newly cultivated childhoods were released with the disorientation of someone waking from anesthesia. Others were left with memories so hybrid they could no longer tell whether the warmth they felt for a past belonged to them or to a recorded lie. A few clung with fury to the invented pasts, as if someone had tried to take from them a comfort they had only just been given. Miriam sat with the group and proposed a remedy that was at once monstrous and humane. "Some of us still hold this like a wound," she said. "If you've been given a past you didn't have, you might prefer not to have it. The tape offered soft things that were not yours. We can ask people if they want to keep those memories, but if they choose to be free, they'll have to accept a loss. Someone must consent to forget. It is an old, dangerous mercy to offer to wipe memory to prevent suffering. Philosophers have argued about whether a stolen consolation is better than a cruel clarity." Jamie watched the others with a careful, tender gaze. People who had been made whole by fiction would not necessarily see the destruction as benevolence. Miriam looked at Jamie and said quietly, "I will do it. I will forget the show. I will be free of it if that helps others keep what is actually theirs." Her voice was steady and metal bright. "No," Jamie said before they could think. The chest's old reflex to protect the frightened and the guilty rose up like a tide. "I." The words stumbled in their mouth. "I'll offer something else. I'll trade." It was a childish bargaining strategy made adult by desperation. Give an identity for everyone else's peace. Miriam protested, hands fluttering. "You don't understand what that means." "Neither do I," Jamie admitted, "but I have places that feel borrowed. If something of me is a stitched garment, maybe it's safer to let that go. Maybe if I give the part of me that the tape tried to claim, the rest of it snaps back into the place it belongs." The decision was a kind of sacrament, not in the religious sense, but in the small mechanics of exchange. Jamie sat with legal counsel and a small team of therapists. There were forms and ingestion rituals of blue light and binding promises written in precise clinical language. The trade was codified. Jamie would relinquish certain memories the tape had claimed, specific scenes, names, the laughing voice captured on that cassette under the floorboard, while witnesses and volunteers would keep the memories they had of their own lives. The agreement was imperfect. Memory refuses to be wholly parceled by paperwork. It was also the most honest thing any of them could imagine doing. On the day of the exchange, they gathered in the studio. Jamie sat before a microphone that recorded and cataloged each relinquishment as it happened. One by one, under clinical guidance, Jamie recited the memories they would let go. The smell of a backyard barbecue that might not have happened, the image of a paper hat with Tommy scrawled across it, a laugh that echoed in a cassette. Each recitation was followed by a ritual hush, murmured phrases from the clinicians, a soft pressure of a hand on the forehead, a small, procedural thing to mark the transfer. It hurt in a way that was concrete. There was a sensation like opening an old wound and washing it out. Some memories slid away like oiled beads, others clung like burrs, stubborn and tangled. At the end of it, Jamie felt both narrower and oddly lighter. There were empty spaces in them, small, quiet rooms without furniture. The gaps were disorienting and precise. They were the price of stopping a thing from being made into a narrative at someone else's will. Outside, the town settled into a new, cluttered peace. Some people rebuffed the council that asked them to consider whether they wanted to keep the offered past. They felt legitimately robbed. Others were freed and grateful. Dex went quiet for a long time. His accounts were scrubbed, and rumor said a contract had been drafted to keep him off the public stage. People speculated about exile. Rumors about the show's lingering altars never quite vanished. Jamie found their life reassembled like a thrift store jacket. A patch here, a new lining there. Some things fit, others did not. Their channel pivoted from debunking to counseling, and people wrote to them with notes that ranged from fury to gratitude to grief. They helped create support systems for those who had been woven into the show's imagined histories. They became, in a way, a midwife to people learning to trust their own incompleteness again. In the weeks after the exchange, Jamie woke sometimes with the sense of a missing limb, an ease they could no longer name. The cassette under the floorboard's laugh no longer hummed in their mind. The name Tommy had become a place that existed somewhere in their life's atlas, but with no route marked toward it. Some nights they dreamed of paper hats drifting like leaves across the sky. But other nights were clearer, quieter. They could go to their mother and feel present in small, unmanufactured ways. They laughed at things that were honestly theirs. Bad coffee, a friend's joke, the particular shamble of their cat trying to cross the kitchen counter. Those were real and imperfect and worse in the best ways. Months later, the internet had mostly moved on. The hashtag sagged into an archive. Scholars wrote papers that no one outside their field read. Harlow returned to its slow cadence. The diner still offered eggs for breakfast. Children still painted murals at the community center. But the edges of small towns are porous. Some mornings a child on a porch would hum a tune no one could, in good conscience, say belonged to them. Jamie's channel had grown. People followed for honest things now. Resources, context, quiet interviews with towns who had weathered the phenomenon. They were careful with their words. The thumbnails were less sensational. They had learned the exact arithmetic of attention and harm and tried clumsily and well to temper virality with care. On a rain-muffled afternoon, a package arrived at Jamie's door. The cardboard was cheap and a little bowed. On its face, in handwriting that set something along their spine, humming like a tuning fork, someone had written, "For you." They did not open it at once. They sat with it on the kitchen table with a cup of coffee gone cold. The house smelled like lemon oil and laundry, like the small domestic things that make lives true. They read the handwriting again. It looked like their own, and for an instant, a tiny private alarm sounded. They had promised something away. They had given up a part of a past that might have been stitched by someone else. Was the handwriting a prank? A leftover artifact? They slit the tape box open with their thumbnail and lifted out a single VHS cassette. The label had no title, only a small string of digits, and on the leader, someone had written in a childish loop, "Remember me." Their first reaction was to burn it. That made sense in the old moral calculus. They had burned a master before, and burning felt like an act that honored caution. But the burning had proven insufficient. The world was not a place where a single fire could undo what hundreds of small eyes had seen and then agreed to keep. Instead, Jamie set the tape on the kitchen counter and, with an evenness they had learned from a dozen hard choices, threaded it into a portable player. The jingle came in small, not once but twice, like an echo. The picture wavered and then smoothed. A red balloon rose through a cracked ceiling to the world outside and caught the light like a small, stubborn sun. A blurred figure leaned toward the camera, face anonymous, and then the frame washed to white. Jamie closed the player. The room hummed. The tape did not feel menacing. It felt like something that had been waiting. They thought, for a long moment, of the small blank rooms that had been left in them after the exchange. They thought of the people who had chosen to keep an invented memory because it was a talisman that made them softer in some places. They thought of those who had been relieved to be free of the false warmth and who preferred thin, honest cold. Jamie set the cassette back into its box. They wrote one sentence on a Post-it and stuck it to the lid. Not mine. It was not a denial of the world's strangeness. It was an ordinary litmus, a boundary made thin by choice but held. They could no longer tell if every memory that calmed them was authentic, but they could choose whether some small things would have the authority of their consent. Outside, a child let a red balloon go. It bobbed up into the gray, a stubborn dot of color. Jamie watched it until it disappeared into cloud. When they closed their eyes, the image of it lingered, bright, patient, and they wondered if that was enough. They had saved some people and cost others some private comforts. The ledger of consequence did not balance itself neatly. On the kitchen table, under the last smear of afternoon, Jamie placed the cassette in a shoebox labeled with neat handwriting and slid it under the bed. It was not the same as burning it. It was not perfection. It was a choice to keep the dangerous thing out of reach while remembering that danger had not fully died. When night came, Jamie dreamed not of paper hats, but of small shoes walking back to their owners. They woke before dawn, the clock blinking 4:44, and for a long, patient minute they sat still and listened to the sounds of a house that belonged, imperfectly and honestly, to them. Outside the window, through the blue of early morning, a balloon drifted past, someone's forgotten party favor moving on the city's breath. Jamie watched it go and let the image fold into the day. The tape was still in the world. Memory was still porous and dangerous and sometimes beautiful. The challenge had become a question the culture would return to again and again. What do we owe one another when we can make each other's pasts? Jamie brewed coffee and thought about answers that would never be final. They had refused a script, and in refusing had made room for other people to refuse as well. That, in the end, felt like a small kind of salvation. The red balloon was gone, but it had left a light mark on the sky, a stain you could trace if you squinted. They would watch that mark and keep their hands in their pockets when strangers offered them easy, bright consolations. The world moved on, imperfect and obstinate. The tape stayed under the bed, a dangerous relic, a reminder that stories could be kind and cruel in equal measure. Jamie turned on the kettle. The day began.